So last April, shortly after the NBA season was suspended due to the pandemic, Bulls fans received some incredible news that the ownership had finally decided to make a change in the front office by getting rid of John Paxson and Gar Forman after over a decade of running the organization, and they were replaced with the Denver Nuggets GM Arturas Karnisovas, and later Karnisovas hired Marc Eversley from the Philadelphia 76ers. And then we received even better news months later after the new front office decided to part ways with the Bulls head coach in Jim Boylan. And a few weeks after that, the Bulls then hired Billy Donovan after Donovan and the Oklahoma City Thunder had agreed to part ways 5 years with him working for the organization. Now, because we graded the Bulls team as a whole for the season and the individual players, which I'll leave link for you guys in the description in case you missed those videos, how should we be grading the new front office and Billy Donovan in their first season with the Bulls? And that's what I want to talk about in this video. So what's going on, everyone? You were listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Guys, before I get into the video, feel free to join the Bulls Central Discord, which is linked in the description. The community continues to grow there. It's a great place to just discuss Bulls basketball and other topics. You can also follow me on Instagram as well if you're interested, as I'm going to start being more active in there on the off season. And you can also check out the websites to any of my sponsors. But anyway, as for this new front office and of course Billy Donovan and the coaching staff, look, and I know I sound like a broken record at this point because I've said it so many times, but we can't deny as Bulls fans that this was an incredibly disappointing season. Whether you want to call this an evaluation year or not, we still would have expected more from the Bulls in at least making the play-in, especially after the midseason trades that were made. Missing the play-in was inexcusable. Now, I will say, I'm not going to get too worked up about it because I do still believe that the future of this team is bright, and I think with this front office, they will bring the Bulls back to relevancy. It's not something that is just going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. And so I want to start there in terms of grading the front office's performance this season. So Arturas Karnisovas and Marc Eversley, they inherited a mess of a team from Gar Pax. You had a lot of young guys, most of which who had talent, they just didn't really work well together. And the culture that Gar Pax left behind was shaky to say the least. Players didn't trust the coaching staff. They didn't trust the front office. They had implemented this losing culture for so many years because they were rebuilding and tanking to build through the draft. The players more often than not played selfish ISO basketball with a sort of every man for himself type mentality, and it's hard to repair that mentality and culture that was left behind. So this new front office had their work cut out for them, to say the least. So I think we need to bear that in mind, despite the fact that it was a disappointing season, and I know many want to blame part of that on the new front office. There was a lot to clean up, and it's not something that you're going to be able to fix instantly. Now, in just one season that they had, they actually made some substantial changes, in reworking this roster and starting to create their own team. So if we review the moves that they made in just their first year, and I want to consider all the positives and negatives from each move. They fired Jim Boylan. That's definitely a positive and something that needed to happen for this franchise to be successful. They hired Billy Donovan, which I'll leave more as a neutral at this point. If you've been watching my channel for a while now, you know that I was never really that high on the Donovan hire, which I'll get into in a little bit, but he was better than most of the other options that were out there at the time that the decision was made. Then the front office signed Garrett Temple in free agency to a one-year deal, which at the time I thought was kind of a so what signing, but then turned out to be one of the more underrated signings in the league for the amount that they were able to get for him and his veteran leadership. So I would consider that to be a positive. Then they chose to extend Denzel Valentine a qualifying offer and prioritize him over Chris Dunn, which I personally think was a mistake, even though I know Dunn was injured most of the season. But either way, I was actually a very, very big Chris Dunn fan. For his flaws, what I loved was his scrappy defense and energy, and that's something that the Bulls really, really could have used, over someone like Denzel Valentine, who thinks he's Steph Curry when he steps onto the court. They also chose not to bring back Shaquille Harrison, which I also thought was a mistake given his defensive ability as well. And now, fast forward to the trade deadline, since no other moves were really made up until then. And then you had the new front office really started showing the fact that they are going to be aggressive in their approach to fixing this team. Now, the trade deadline as a whole and the moves that they made, to me, was an absolute positive. And I'll get into why, as I know there were some who felt that the front office completely missed on the changes that were made at the deadline. Now, first and foremost, the Vucevic trade. I mean, this was clearly a win if you're a Bulls fan. I know it may not seem like it right now because the Bulls did not perform well after the trade was made. And of course, we traded away future assets to get him. But at the end of the day, this trade is going to benefit the Bulls in the long run. Because first of all, the Bulls desperately needed a big man who could rebound. Second, Vucevic is an all-star caliber big man. And third, it is so much easier in attracting free agents and building a contending team when you already have 2 all-stars on your roster. So you can say what you want about Vucevic not fitting on this roster, or that he's soft and his defense is terrible, which is not the case, but the fact of the matter is a move like that brings you back to relevancy. And the moves that were made didn't allow for enough time for these guys to get acclimated to one another, especially when you had Lavine out for 4 weeks due to the health and safety protocol. Troy Brown Jr. missed considerable time, and even Tice missed some time as well after the trade deadline. So I've said this before, but with a full offseason, a full training camp of these guys working together, and hopefully with all of the health and safety measures in place, these guys are going to improve greatly. We already saw it in those final games of the season once Lavine returned and the guys started playing well together. So for the Vucevic trade, I consider that to be a positive. Now for the other trades, well, I guess I should say the players we let go in these trades. Luke Cornett, whatever, that doesn't mean anything. Chandler Hutchinson, you know, I do still think he had some potential, but I was fine in letting him go. But you guys all know that I was a huge Daniel Gafford fan. I love that guy's energy. I loved his hustle. He has a lot of flaws to his game, I won't deny that, but I was pretty disappointed they include him in a trade package and really felt that that was just too soon of a move to be giving up on him, given the fact that he was only in his 2nd season in the league. And of course, Gafford really started balling out with the Wizards to make matters worse. So I do think that was a negative for the front office. Likely won't matter in the long run, but I would have preferred for them to hold on to Gafford in just being a solid backup big off of the bench. But then again, the front office brought in Tice, which I think is a win, even though he's on an expiring deal. They brought in Troy Brown Jr. I think that will be a huge win in the long run, given his potential and the fact that he's a great defender. Again, something the Bulls need. It was just unfortunate that he missed so much time after the deadline. So with all of that being said, and I know that was a bit long-winded, but how do we grade the front office this season? Well, in the Discord, you know, for the people who voted on the end season grades, most of you thought that they deserved an A, which I was a little surprised by. I mean, I figured they would get a lot of A's, and I wouldn't disagree with you if you did give them an A. I still think overall they did a great job in their first season with what they had to work with, but I was surprised to see such a huge discrepancy between A's and B's. Now, you had a few that gave D's and F's. No, that's not fair at all. But for me personally, I gave them a B, really a B+, but that's not an option here. And I gave them a B+ because although I liked most of their moves and what they're trying to do with the roster, I would have preferred them going with a different coach for this roster, someone like Nate McMillan, or even taking a chance on a guy like Ime Udoka, who had a proven track record as an associate and assistant head coach, and he's very well respected by the players. But Billy Donovan obviously wasn't a bad hire either, given it's also nice to go after a coach that actually has head coaching experience in the NBA, something the Bulls really haven't done since Phil Jackson. You could even argue he was hired after being an assistant coach under Doug Collins. But anyway, that move I thought was just okay. And then as much as I do like the Vucevic trade, and I think it will pay off for the Bulls in the long run, it's a huge gamble, and it's possible it might not pay off, which would be a huge loss for the Bulls and could set them back for a number of years when you traded away those draft picks to get him. And then, of course, I wasn't a fan of the Daniel Gafford move, but I also understand bringing in Tice and Troy Brown Jr. are better pieces for the Bulls in terms of what they needed to complement the lack of defense on the roster. So I'm, in between a B+ and an A- for this new front office. But for the first season on the job, they did well. They showed aggression. They showed that they're not going to settle for mediocrity. In fact, they actually said that in their exit interview, and they're going to pursue improving this roster even further. Now, as for Billy Donovan and the coaching staff, and as I mentioned, I wasn't that high on the Billy Donovan hire, but what I do think is great about Billy Donovan is that, he does fit this roster in that he's very well respected by the players, which is not something that we had last season under Jim Boylen, and really under Fred Hoiberg, for that matter. The other thing is Billy Donovan is a great player development coach, which Given the age of the Bulls before the deadline anyway, it was something that the guys really needed, a coach that was going to help them grow and also establish strong relationships with them. Billy Donovan, as I'm sure most of you know, was a head coach in college for a long time before coming to the NBA, so he knows how to relate to younger players and get the most out of them to motivate them and get them better. And what I like seeing from this coaching staff that we didn't see last year was that the Bulls team was considerably better at fighting through adversity in games. You know, last season the Bulls would fall behind, or the opposing team would go on a run and gain some momentum, and they would get their heads down, start playing hero ball, and would eventually just give up. But in this season, not all the time anyway, but most of the time, the guys wouldn't let that get them down. They were able to bounce back after trailing by large amounts. They wouldn't let momentum swings get to them as much, and their overall confidence had improved. The other thing I liked seeing was the ball movement. That was significantly better than what we saw last year, where really the Bulls were more focused on heavy isolation plays, and points were rarely scored off assisted plays last season. And that's something Billy Donovan's system thrives off of is ball and player movement, which the Bulls, a little more slowly adapted to, but they got there. They were actually one of the best passing teams in the league in terms of assists per game, finishing 8th in the league. Now, the things that I didn't like seeing from Billy Donovan, well, for one, mid-game adjustments and rotations. I mean, there were so many times throughout the season when I was watching games where I just was scratching my head trying to understand some of his rotations. Now, part of that, could have been the fact that, he's trying to evaluate the team early on, but towards the end of the season, mid-season to end of the season, you would expect that that would have been figured out by then, and not putting guys in who didn't fit other players on the court. I mean, I still can't, for the life of me, understand why Denzel Valentine played so much time in closeout game situations. I just can't. And then he would go with a group that was heavy on offense with no defensive players when they were up big, and then the opposing team would make a run and come back into the game as a result. And then the other thing about adjustments, you would have coaches that would make their adjustments against the Bulls when something wasn't working well for them, and Billy Donovan wouldn't respond with his own adjustments as a result to counter it. That Spurs game, in which the Bulls were up by 23 points and the game looked all but over until Popovich made adjustments to his roster to focus on defending Lavine and then also getting the Bulls tired, and then the Spurs won on a 17-0 run and came back to win the game. Those are the type of games that come to mind when I think about that. I mean, that cannot happen if you're a coach. The other thing that bothered me about Billy Donovan was the fact that he just didn't seem to work these guys hard enough on defense. There were multiple post-game press conferences where you would have Billy Donovan harp on his guys and their lack of effort on the defensive end, which rightfully so. I'm not faulting him for making those comments, but that's also on you as a coach to start pushing them more in practice and holding them accountable for their poor effort on defense. Like, I get that a lot of these guys on the roster aren't the best defenders, but you're professional basketball players. The least you can do is try, play hard, play scrappy. Don't get lazy on that end of the floor and only focus on offense. There's just no excuse for that. So I do put some of that on Billy Donovan, because you can't just say that you're frustrated with your roster and the effort on defense. You're the coach. Do something about it. And then, of course, turnovers. I mean, I know that's obviously on the players, but when your team is the worst in the league when it comes to turning the ball over and you're giving up 20+ turnovers in some games, come on. Some of this has to be on the coaching as well, to work with these guys and taking care of the basketball. Maybe they're not following your system on offense. Maybe they're not reading the right plays, making the right cuts or switches that is enabling them to commit so many turnovers. And yes, like I said, part of that is on the players. They're the ones playing on the court and committing those turnovers, but that's also on the coach to fix that. And I sincerely hope that next season the Bulls get better at taking care of the ball, because the prime reason they lost so many games was because of so many turnovers that they committed. As for grading Billy Donovan's season, I mean, from the Discord anyway, you can see Billy Donovan did get a handful of A's, but mostly B's and C's. I actually gave him a C, trending more towards a C+, and really it's for all the reasons that I just mentioned. He had some great areas of his coaching style that I like, but at the end of the day, he has to be held accountable for the Bulls finishing 11th in the East with the talent level that they had. Failing to even make it to the play-in game does not warrant him anything above a C, in my opinion. But I would love to hear what you guys think, though. Let me know in the comments how you would grade both Billy Donovan and the front office's performance in their first season of play. I'll also throw out a community poll for it as well. As always, be sure to subscribe to the channel, as I really do appreciate it. And as always, thanks for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.